He sat alone, hands folded, staring at the wall of names. Children played nearby, adults walked past without a second glance, just another elderly man spending his afternoon at the memorial. No one noticed the way his weathered fingers traced invisible patterns in the air, as if he were reading something only he could see. But then black SUVs pulled up with tinted windows and government plates, causing heads to turn and conversations to stop mid-sentence. A four-star general stepped out, his uniform pressed to perfection and his bearing unmistakably military. He walked directly toward the old man sitting on the bench, ignoring the curious stares of tourists and families who had gathered to watch. Without hesitation, without explanation, the general stopped directly in front of the elderly visitor and snapped the most perfect salute anyone had ever witnessed. Because that man wasn't just anyone visiting the memorial, he was the reason some of those names on the wall were never carved there in the first place. The silence that followed was deafening, as everyone present realized they were witnessing something extraordinary. The general held his salute with unwavering precision, while the old man slowly rose from the bench, his movements careful but dignified. When he returned the salute, his military bearing became unmistakable despite his age and civilian clothes. This wasn't a grandfather enjoying a peaceful afternoon. This was a hero finally receiving the recognition he had never asked for but always deserved. The crowd that had gathered began to understand that they were in the presence of living history. The names on the memorial wall represented sacrifice and heroism, but the man on the bench represented something equally powerful: the courage to save lives and bring soldiers home. As word spread through whispered conversations and shared glances, people began to grasp the magnitude of what they were witnessing: a reunion between brothers in arms separated by decades, but united by bonds forged in the crucible of combat. Welcome to Silent Salute. Before we continue this powerful story, tell us in the comments from which city in the world are you watching this video today? And if you think stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. We're growing every day, and I sincerely thank you for being a part of it. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial Wall stretched across the landscape like a black granite wound cutting into the earth and reflecting the faces of those who came to remember. Located in Washington, D.C., the memorial had become a pilgrimage site for families, veterans, and citizens who wanted to honor the 58,000 Americans whose names were etched into its polished surface. On this particular autumn afternoon, the wall drew its usual mixture of visitors, from school groups learning about history to elderly veterans confronting memories they had carried for decades. Among the diverse crowd of visitors, one figure sat alone on a wooden bench positioned to face the memorial wall directly. Frank Morrison was 81 years old, with silver hair that caught the afternoon sunlight and hands that showed the accumulated wear of 8 decades of living. He wore a simple button-down shirt and khaki pants, the kind of unremarkable civilian clothing that made him blend seamlessly into the background of tourists and families who moved past him throughout the day. Frank had been visiting the memorial regularly for over 20 years, always choosing the same bench and always spending his time in quiet contemplation. To casual observers, he appeared to be just another elderly man, perhaps a veteran himself, who came to remember fallen comrades or reflect on his own service. Children playing nearby paid him no attention, while their parents focused on explaining the significance of the memorial to their families. What none of them realized was that Frank's relationship with the memorial was far more complex and profound than simple remembrance. As he sat quietly on his bench, his eyes moved systematically across the wall, reading names that most visitors would never notice. But Frank wasn't reading randomly. He was conducting a mental roll call of men whose lives had intersected with his own during the darkest days of the Vietnam War. Each name he found represented not just a fallen soldier, but a life he had personally touched during his service as a helicopter pilot. Frank Morrison had flown over 300 combat missions in Vietnam, piloting a UH-1 Huey helicopter that had earned the nickname Lifeline among the units he supported. His specialty hadn't been dropping soldiers into combat zones or providing fire support. His mission had been extraction and medical evacuation, flying into hot landing zones under enemy fire to retrieve wounded soldiers and bring them home. During his 2 tours of duty, Frank had pulled over 400 wounded men from battlefields across Southeast Asia, many of them so close to death that minutes meant the difference between survival and becoming another name on a memorial wall. The irony of Frank's situation was that his heroism had created an inverse relationship with the memorial. While the names on the wall represented ultimate sacrifice, Frank's success was measured by the names that weren't there. Every soldier he had extracted from a jungle clearing, every wounded man he had rushed to a medical facility, every desperate evacuation he had completed under enemy fire represented a name that would never be carved into the black granite. His legacy wasn't written in stone, it was walking around living full lives with families and careers made possible by his courage and skill. But Frank had never sought recognition for his service and had actively avoided the kind of public acknowledgement that many veterans received upon returning home. He had quietly transitioned to civilian life, working as a commercial pilot for 30 years before retiring to a small house in suburban Virginia. He maintained contact with some of the men he had served with, but had never joined veteran organizations or attended reunion events, preferring to process his war experiences privately. His regular visits to the memorial served a dual purpose that he had never fully explained to anyone, including his late wife, who had sometimes accompanied him on these quiet pilgrimages. On one level, Frank came to remember and honor the men who hadn't made it home, understanding that their sacrifice had given meaning to his own survival. But on a deeper level, he came to conduct his own private inventory, checking names against his memory to ensure that none of the men he had extracted from combat zones had later died in ways that weren't reflected in the official records. Frank's system was methodical and deeply personal. He would start at one end of the memorial wall and work his way systematically through the names, searching for soldiers he remembered rescuing. When he found a name that he recognized, his heart would sink because it meant that someone he had saved had later died in circumstances he wasn't aware of. When he failed to find names he was looking for, it brought a quiet satisfaction because it suggested that his efforts had made a permanent difference in someone's life. This particular afternoon, Frank was engaged in his usual routine when he noticed unusual activity in the parking area adjacent to the memorial. A convoy of black SUVs with government license plates was arriving with the kind of coordinated precision that suggested official business. Frank watched with mild curiosity as the vehicles positioned themselves strategically around the memorial area, while men in dark suits emerged to establish what appeared to be a security perimeter. The arrival of official vehicles at the memorial wasn't unusual, since the site frequently hosted ceremonial events and visits by government dignitaries. But there was something different about this particular arrival that caught Frank's attention. The security personnel weren't directing visitors away from the memorial or preparing for a large public event. Instead, they seemed to be focusing their attention on the area where Frank was sitting, maintaining a discreet but obvious protective presence. Frank's military training allowed him to recognize the signs of a high-level security operation, even though he couldn't understand why such measures would be necessary at a memorial site during a routine afternoon. The men establishing the perimeter were clearly professionals with the kind of coordinated movements and communication protocols that suggested extensive training and experience. Their presence transformed the atmosphere around the memorial from casual tourism to something more serious and purposeful. As Frank continued to observe the developing situation, one of the SUVs opened to reveal a figure that immediately commanded attention and respect. General Marcus Thompson emerged from the vehicle wearing a dress uniform that displayed 4 stars on his shoulders, indicating his rank as a full general in the United States Army. Thompson was in his early 60s, with the kind of bearing and presence that marked him as someone accustomed to command and responsibility at the highest levels of military leadership. General Thompson's arrival explained the security measures and the official nature of the visit, but it didn't explain why he seemed to be looking specifically in Frank's direction. The general walked purposefully toward the memorial wall, but his attention was clearly focused on the bench where Frank was sitting rather than on the names etched into the granite surface. As he approached, Frank could see recognition in the general's eyes, as if he were confirming the identity of someone he had been specifically looking for. The moment of recognition was mutual and instantaneous. Frank looked up from his quiet contemplation to see a face he remembered from decades earlier, though it had been younger then and wearing different insignia. Lieutenant Marcus Thompson had been one of the men Frank had extracted from a jungle clearing near the Cambodian border during the final months of American involvement in Vietnam. The young officer had been critically wounded by shrapnel from a mortar attack and had been unconscious when Frank's helicopter had lifted him from a landing zone under heavy enemy fire. Frank rose slowly from his bench, his movements careful but respectful as he recognized the young lieutenant he had once pulled from a battlefield. General Thompson approached with obvious emotion visible in his expression, though he maintained the military bearing that had carried him through decades of service and leadership. The two men faced each other across 47 years of separation, understanding immediately that this reunion had been decades in the making. Without speaking, General Thompson came to attention and rendered the most precise military salute Frank had ever witnessed. The general's posture was perfect, his timing was exact, and his expression conveyed a depth of gratitude and respect that transcended military protocol. This wasn't a ceremonial gesture or a public display, it was a personal acknowledgement from one soldier to another, recognizing a debt that could never be fully repaid. Frank returned the salute with equal precision, his own military training reasserting itself despite the passage of decades. For a moment, the two men held their salutes, while the significance of their reunion settled over the gathering crowd of observers. Tourists and families who had been casually visiting the memorial began to understand that they were witnessing something extraordinary, a moment of recognition between veterans that highlighted the personal connections underlying the abstract concept of military service. When the salutes were completed, General Thompson extended his hand and spoke in a voice that carried across the memorial area, ensuring that everyone present could hear his words. "Master Sergeant Morrison, I've been looking for you for 47 years to thank you for saving my life." The use of Frank's military rank surprised the civilians who had seen only an elderly man sitting quietly on a bench, but it immediately conveyed the significance of what they were witnessing. Frank accepted the handshake with quiet dignity, showing no signs of surprise or discomfort at being recognized in such a public setting. He had always known that his extraction missions had saved lives, but he had never expected or sought recognition for doing what he considered his duty as a soldier. The general's gratitude was genuine and deeply felt, but Frank's response was characteristically modest, acknowledging Thompson's thanks while deflecting attention from his own actions. General Thompson wasn't content with a simple exchange of thanks because he understood that this moment represented something larger than personal gratitude. He had spent decades building a distinguished military career, rising through the ranks to positions of significant responsibility and leadership. Throughout his career, he had never forgotten the helicopter pilot who had risked his own life to extract wounded soldiers from combat zones, understanding that his own survival and success were directly connected to Frank's courage and skill. The general addressed the growing crowd of observers, explaining that they were in the presence of one of the most decorated helicopter pilots of the Vietnam War. He described Frank's service record, which included over 300 combat missions and more than 400 successful evacuations of wounded personnel. Thompson emphasized that Frank's actions had directly saved hundreds of lives, including his own, and had made it possible for those men to return home to their families and build meaningful civilian lives. As General Thompson spoke, the atmosphere around the memorial underwent a complete transformation. Visitors who had been casually touring the site began to understand that they were witnessing a piece of living history. Children who had been playing nearby gathered with their parents to listen, while elderly visitors who might have been veterans themselves moved closer to hear the general's account of Frank's wartime service. The general continued his impromptu speech, describing the specific mission during which Frank had saved his life. Thompson had been leading a reconnaissance patrol near the Cambodian border when his unit had been ambushed by a numerically superior enemy force. During the firefight that followed, Thompson had been critically wounded by mortar shrapnel and had lost consciousness while his men fought to maintain their defensive positions. Frank's helicopter had received the evacuation request during one of the most dangerous periods of the engagement, when enemy forces were actively targeting any aircraft that attempted to approach the landing zone. Despite the obvious risks, Frank had flown directly into the combat area, using his exceptional piloting skills to land in a clearing barely large enough for his helicopter while enemy rounds impacted around his aircraft. The evacuation had taken place under continuous fire, with Frank's crew chief and medic working frantically to load Thompson and two other wounded soldiers, while Frank maintained his position in the landing zone. The helicopter had taken multiple hits during the extraction, but Frank had successfully lifted off and flown the wounded men to a medical facility where Thompson had undergone emergency surgery that saved his life. General Thompson's account of the rescue mission provided context that helped the gathered crowd understand the extraordinary nature of Frank's service. This wasn't just a story about military duty or following orders, it was an example of individual courage and skill making the difference between life and death for fellow soldiers. The general's survival and subsequent career had been made possible by Frank's willingness to risk everything for men he might never see again. As the general concluded his remarks, the crowd began to respond with spontaneous applause, recognizing that they had been privileged to witness a moment of historical significance. But Frank raised his hand to quiet the applause, showing the same discomfort with recognition that had characterized his entire approach to his military service. He spoke briefly, thanking General Thompson for his kind words, but emphasizing that he had been part of a team effort that included crew chiefs, medics, and countless other support personnel who had made the evacuations possible. Frank's response was characteristic of the humility and teamwork that had defined his military service, but General Thompson wasn't willing to let him deflect recognition so easily. The general pointed out that while Frank was correct about the team nature of military operations, his individual contribution had been extraordinary and deserving of recognition. Thompson noted that Frank had volunteered for the most dangerous missions, repeatedly risking his life to save others without regard for his own safety. The general then revealed information that surprised even Frank, explaining that he had spent years after the war trying to locate the helicopter pilot who had saved his life. Thompson had eventually risen to positions where he had access to military records and personnel files, allowing him to research Frank's complete service record and track his post-war activities. The general had discovered that Frank's 300 combat missions and 400 successful evacuations made him one of the most accomplished helicopter pilots in military history. General Thompson's research had revealed additional details about Frank's service that even Frank himself might not have fully appreciated. The general had discovered that Frank had been awarded multiple decorations, including the Distinguished Flying Cross, with 2 oak leaf clusters, the Air Medal with 15 oak leaf clusters, and the Bronze Star with Valor Device. These awards had been processed through military bureaucracy without fanfare or public recognition, leaving Frank unaware of the full extent of his official recognition. The general also revealed that Frank's extraction missions had created a ripple effect that extended far beyond the immediate lives he had saved. Many of the men Frank had rescued had gone on to distinguished military careers of their own, while others had returned to civilian life to become teachers, doctors, business leaders, and community volunteers. The 400 men Frank had pulled from combat zones had collectively raised thousands of children, contributed to their communities in countless ways, and created a legacy of service and citizenship that could be traced directly back to his courage and skill. Thompson explained that he had been able to track down many of the men Frank had rescued and had discovered stories of extraordinary post-war achievements and contributions. One man had become a renowned surgeon who had saved thousands of lives during his medical career. Another had founded a non-profit organization that provided educational opportunities for disadvantaged children. Several had become teachers and coaches who had influenced generations of young people, while others had built successful businesses that employed hundreds of workers. The general's research had also revealed the broader strategic impact of Frank's service, which had extended beyond individual evacuations to influence the overall effectiveness of American forces in Vietnam. Units operating in remote areas had been willing to take greater risks and conduct more aggressive operations because they knew that helicopter pilots like Frank would extract them if they were wounded. This confidence had translated into tactical advantages that had saved additional lives and contributed to mission success throughout Frank's operational area. As General Thompson shared these details, Frank listened with obvious surprise and emotion, clearly learning for the first time about the full scope of his wartime impact. The general's research had provided him with a perspective on his own service that 47 years of quiet reflection had never revealed. Frank had always known that he had saved lives, but he had never understood the exponential effect those saved lives had created through decades of subsequent achievement and contribution. The crowd of memorial visitors had grown steadily as word spread about the reunion taking place near the wall. People began approaching Frank to thank him personally for his service, while others asked to take photographs or simply to shake his hand. Children who had been learning about the Vietnam War in school suddenly had a living connection to the history they were studying, while their parents gained new appreciation for the individual stories behind abstract concepts like military service and sacrifice. But the most meaningful responses came from other veterans who had been visiting the memorial and recognized the significance of what they were witnessing. Several elderly men approached Frank with their own stories of helicopter evacuations during Vietnam, expressing gratitude for pilots like him who had risked everything to bring wounded soldiers home. One man revealed that he had been evacuated by helicopter after being wounded near Da Nang, though he had never learned the name of his pilot. The spontaneous gathering around Frank and General Thompson created an impromptu memorial service that honored not just Frank's individual achievements, but the broader community of veterans who had served with courage and dedication. Stories were shared about other helicopter pilots, medics, crew chiefs, and support personnel who had made similar sacrifices to save lives and complete missions under impossible conditions. General Thompson used the opportunity to address some of the misconceptions and negative stereotypes that had affected Vietnam veterans for decades, explaining that men like Frank represented the true character of American military service. The general emphasized that Frank's story was representative of thousands of other veterans who had served with honor and distinction despite the controversial nature of the war and the difficult reception they had received upon returning home. As the afternoon progressed, Frank found himself surrounded by people who wanted to hear more about his experiences and learn from his perspective on military service and sacrifice. He responded to their questions with the same quiet dignity and modesty that had characterized his entire approach to his military career, never seeking to glorify war or his own actions, but helping others understand the human dimension of military service. The general remained throughout the extended gathering, serving as both witness and advocate for Frank's recognition, while ensuring that the focus remained on honoring service rather than celebrating individual glory. Thompson's presence added weight and credibility to Frank's story while providing historical context that helped civilian visitors understand the significance of what they were learning. As the day began to wind down, General Thompson made one final gesture that surprised everyone present, including Frank himself. The general announced that he had been working with military historians and veterans organizations to ensure that Frank's story and service record would be properly preserved and recognized. Thompson revealed that Frank was being recommended for additional honors that had been overlooked during the chaotic final years of American involvement in Vietnam. The general also announced that Frank had been invited to participate in upcoming veterans events and memorial ceremonies where his story could be shared with broader audiences who needed to understand the true nature of military service and sacrifice. Thompson emphasized that Frank's recognition wasn't just about honoring past service, but about educating current and future generations about the values and dedication that military service represents. Frank's response to these announcements was characteristically modest, but he agreed to participate in activities that would honor other veterans and educate the public about military service. He understood that his story was valuable not because it was unique, but because it was representative of the courage and dedication that thousands of other veterans had demonstrated during their own service. The reunion at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial concluded with Frank and General Thompson walking together along the wall, reading names and sharing memories about their wartime experiences. Their conversation was private and personal, but their public reunion had created a moment of recognition and education that would influence everyone who had witnessed it. As visitors began to leave the memorial area, many stopped to thank Frank again for his service, while others lingered to read names on the wall with new understanding of the individual stories and sacrifices represented by the black granite surface. The children who had witnessed the reunion would remember it as a defining moment in their understanding of history and sacrifice, while their parents gained new appreciation for the veterans in their own communities. Frank Morrison returned to his quiet bench as the sun began to set over the memorial, understanding that his regular visits would never again be the anonymous pilgrimages they had been for 20 years. His story had been revealed and his service had been recognized, but more importantly, his example had educated a new generation about the meaning of military service and the ongoing responsibility to honor those who had sacrificed for others. The general's SUVs departed as quietly as they had arrived, but the impact of the reunion would continue to resonate through the stories shared by everyone who had witnessed it. Frank's recognition represented more than individual acknowledgement. It demonstrated the ongoing connection between military service and civilian society and the importance of remembering and honoring those who had served with courage and dedication. Sometimes heroes hide in plain sight, sitting quietly on memorial benches and conducting private conversations with names etched in stone. Frank Morrison had spent 47 years visiting the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, not seeking recognition, but honoring the memory of those who hadn't come home. His quiet dignity and consistent devotion had made him invisible to casual observers, but his service and sacrifice had created ripples that extended far beyond his own understanding. The reunion between Frank and General Thompson reminded everyone present that military service creates bonds that transcend time and rank, connecting soldiers across decades through shared experiences of courage, sacrifice, and mutual dependence. Frank's story wasn't just about helicopter evacuations and combat missions. It was about the ongoing responsibility that service members have to each other and to the values they have sworn to defend. In the end, Frank Morrison didn't need recognition or public acknowledgement to validate his service because he had always known that his actions had made a difference in the lives of the men he had saved. But the recognition meant something to the younger generation who learned about military service through his example and to the veteran community who saw their own experiences reflected in his story. This story was brought to you by Silent Salute. Before we leave you today, here's our question. Have you ever known someone who never asked for recognition but deserved more than anyone else? Tell us in the comments what they meant to you and how you remember them. And if you think stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. We'll see you in the next one.